What is going on, everybody? My name is John Solo and welcome to Plot Twist, the show where we talk about some of the changes your favorite movies went through before they became movies. We are going to be talking about Monsters, Inc. today, and holy craps do we have a lot to talk about, because when this movie was first thought up, it was a totally different film. And it was different for quite a while afterwards too. After I go through this list of rejected ideas, you're probably going to be as amazed as I am that the movie turned out as well as it did. And speaking of the list, I say it's time we get started. These are 11 ideas rejected from Monsters, Inc. The initial concept was totally different. When the first draft of the movie was written, it was simply titled Monsters. The monsters were the bad guys in this version, while the protagonist was a 30-year-old man. The story was going to follow this character who was supposed to be afraid of just about everything through his normal daily adult life, when suddenly the monsters that he drew in a book when he was a little kid start coming to life and bothering him. Each of these monsters was to represent a fear that he had, and conquering each fear caused the monsters to disappear. Although I don't like this story nearly as much as the final version, I do like how the conflict is a little more psychological. It sorta reminds me of Inside Out, which makes sense when you take into account that Pete Docter wrote and directed both films. George Sanderson was the main character. After the initial concept was thrown out, Docter decided he wanted to write a buddy movie between a monster and child. What's interesting about this is that the main character wasn't going to be Sulley, but another scare that we see in the final cut, George Sanderson. Some of you may remember him better as the guy who kept getting caught by the CDA for the 2319 emergencies.
George Sanderson, please remain motionless. Prepare for decontamination.
Much like the Sanderson that we all saw, in this story he was going to be a bumbling, inept monster who couldn't scare anyone. Until one day he meets a fearless 7-year-old girl toughened by years of pranks from her 4 older brothers. This character, who was an earlier version of Boo, was going to teach him how to be scarier. Sulley had many different occupations and a different name. After Sanderson, the next idea for a lead character was our beloved Sulley. Except his name wasn't Sulley, it was Johnson. And he also wasn't a scarer. Before deciding to make him the best scarer at Monsters, Inc., the writers also considered making him a janitor, a refinery worker, an untalented scarer, sort of like Sanderson, and my personal favorite, Randall's assistant. Monsters, Inc. was going to be downsizing. Another storyline that was considered involved the downsizing of Monsters Incorporated, so the shrinking of the business and the reducing of the number of employees on the company's payroll. At this point, Johnson was supposed to be an untalented scarer and nervous about the possibility of losing his job. Meanwhile, another monster named Ned, who later became Randall, was the company's top performer, and Johnson was envious of him not having to worry about losing his job. I'm going to take a leap and say this storyline might be an expansion on the one I mentioned earlier with George Sanderson, with Johnson replacing him as the one being taught to be scary. Mike Wazowski was Randall's assistant. At some point while creating Monsters, Inc., the writers realized that no matter what predicament Sulley found himself in, he was going to need a friend to talk about it with that wasn't a little human girl. As a result of this, Mike Wazowski was created. Interestingly though, he wasn't going to be Sulley's assistant or work alongside him in any of the miscellaneous departments at Monsters Incorporated. Instead, he was going to be Randall's assistant. I guess we can thank our lucky stars that that didn't end up happening, and Fungus is the one who got stuck with the job. Fungus had a different name. Speaking of Fungus, his name wasn't actually supposed to be Fungus. Hold on to your hats, because this may be the biggest rejected idea of all. Instead of being named Jeff Fungus, his name was going to be Jeff Frungus. I know, mind blown. Sulley and Mike had different appearances. After the storyline for Monsters, Inc. started to become more concrete and the details solidified, it was time to design Sulley and Mike Wazowski, and neither of them looked as they did in the final version. For instance, Mike originally wasn't going to have arms and was going to use his legs as appendages to clutch onto things. This idea ended up getting scrapped because of technical difficulties. James P. Sullivan actually looked completely different. He was still going to be 8 feet tall and furry, but instead of legs, he was going to have tentacles and he was going to wear glasses. It was the animators who made the final call to bail on these plans. Apparently, the tentacles were really difficult to animate, and they were also afraid that they would distract the audience. The glasses were removed because they obstructed Sulley's eyes, which in movies are usually used to convey a character's emotions. There were many versions of Boo. I told you guys earlier that the initial concept for Boo was a fearless 7-year-old who had 4 older brothers. However, the writers came up with several different alternatives before deciding on the character we all know and love. Even before she was a fearless 7-year-old, she wasn't going to be a she, she was gonna be a he, but the writers ended up deciding that the best counterpart to an 8-foot-tall furry monster was a little girl. After this, they also considered making her African American and Irish. Another trait they toyed around with was her age. As drafts of the story were written and rewritten, Boo kept getting younger and younger. They eventually all decided to make her 3, because the younger she was, the more dependent she was on Sulley. Although I am interested in how the story would have played out had she been a little bit older or from another country, I am happy they decided on the version they did, because she's adorable. Ted was supposed to roar. How many of you guys remember the scene from the beginning of the movie where Sulley and Mike are walking down the street and they run into the giant, massive dinosaur monster Ted? Something pretty funny about this scene is that when Sulley greets Ted, he was originally supposed to roar like Godzilla. However, when the filmmakers reached out to Godzilla's film studio asking for permission to use his roar, they turned him down. So instead, Ted clucks like a chicken.
Hey, Ted! Good morning!
The Mike's New Car short was part of the story. Without a doubt, when I was a little kid, Mike's New Car was my favorite Pixar short before it was dethroned by Jack Jack Attack. An interesting thing about this short, though, is that it wasn't created to be a short, but instead an actual scene in the movie. The filmmakers ended up taking it out because it didn't really fit anywhere in the story and it sort of screwed with the pacing, but they liked it so much that they included it as a bonus feature on the DVD. Bonus fact for you, as a result of this, Mike's New Car was the first Pixar short ever to have dialogue. Roz was going to have a different voice. If you watched my Incredibles episode of Plot Twist, you may recall me saying that the voice of Edna Mode being provided by the film's director, Brad Bird,
If you repress, you depress, darling.
was only supposed to be temporary. Well, the same goes for the voice of one of my favorite characters in Monsters, Inc., Roz.
Well, isn't that nice?
A man named Bob Peterson, who you may know as the co-director of Up, voiced Roz for what was supposed to be just a test screening. However, the nasally sing-song voice proved to be such a success with audiences, they kept it in the final film. And that, my friends, is the final rejected idea that we are going to discuss today. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a favor and show your support by hitting that like button down below and maybe consider sharing it with any Disney Pixar fans you know. Also, of course, be sure to subscribe for weekly Disney and Pixar content. If you're already subscribed, consider following me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for updates on what I'm up to between videos. Thank you all so much for watching. My name is John Solo, and I hope you learned a little something today.